Okay, thank you for joining us for this month's Superversive live stream. We're having a bit of a combined live stream this month with a chat about steampunk, and we recently launched Jon Del Arroz's new book, For Steam and Country, on Superversive Press. This month we have with us the author of For Steam and Country, Jon Del Arroz. Jon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, just had the book come out. It's doing phenomenally, very happy. Thanks everybody, Superversive Press. Thanks all my friends here, and excited to talk about steampunk.
Okay, and we also have Ben Zvitsky back. Ben, do you want to say hi?
Hello everybody, can you hear me properly?
We can.
Hi.
Corey McCleary.
I am one of the co-hosts of the Whippersnappers podcast and author of a fantasy novel called Fever Blood, which is agonizingly slowly being edited right now, all on my end.
Okay, we have Daddy Warpig.
Hello, it is I, blogger and podcaster Daddy Warpig.
He'll be back.
We have John C. Wright back with us again.
Greetings.
And also El Judgy Lamplighter Wright, his wife, and also with them Pierce Oka, who contributed a story to Forbidden Thoughts.
Hi, everybody.
Indeed.
Now, when he talks, he's going to look like me because we're using the same mic.
No problem.
Oh, we can't forget.
And finally, we have Marina Fontaine.
Hi.
Hey, Marina.
So, seeing as John's got the book launch, John, do you want to tell us a bit about For Steam and Country? Why would people want to read this, and what makes it steampunk?
Yeah, I keep saying that I discovered steampunk probably in 2010, 2011 at Dragon Con, where I understand a lot of the Superversive folk are going to be meeting up at Dragon Con this year. And I just followed these people around who were in top hats with goggles and gas masks and all these cool little accessories for their costumes, which had a Victorian sort of theme, and I thought they looked awesome. So I went to their little ball, which was not a little ball. It turns out there were hundreds of people in there. It was pretty sweet. And then the next day I went to the dealer hall, and suddenly $1,000 or so later, my wife and I had steampunk costumes, and we're part of this community. So what I saw from that point was I don't think the literary aspects of like sort of a Victorian fantasy with alternate technology really took off all that much. I mean, you saw it a little bit, but I wanted a real action adventure fantasy with that sort of theming, and so I decided to write it myself, and that was it.
I think steampunk is about to hit a very unexpected roadblock, because up until now the subculture has been really, really bohemian, and it's quite a lot of it is caught up in horror and things like that. And I think the arrival of pulp writers and pulp revolutionaries is going to kind of overturn a lot of things and make a lot of people upset.
Yeah, it's interesting. You get two kind of dynamics. Sorry, Judgy.
Okay, you go first.
I agree. There's a lot of that like kind of horror-ish element to the crowd that like almost came out of like a goth culture, I guess, is kind of where I'd put it at. And then there's also like the sort of teen romance group kind of latched onto it for a bit with because they came from the Ren fairs with the Victorian cosplays, and so those two groups kind of converged, and that's the literature you got out of it, and that's the theme you got out of it, and that I agree. We'll see how this is received with that community, because it is definitely a different take on steampunk completely.
What I was going to say is that I think that there is a natural pulps and the steampunk genre, the mood and the tropes of it have a natural possible marriage there. A pulpy steampunk, I think, would be a lot more enjoyable than some of the more, I don't know what the word is for it, but some of the stuff that I've seen. I think we could, I look forward to that marriage. Pulpy steampunk.
Yeah. Well, I know I've read. Go.
I was just going to say, the Jules Verne novels themselves and the scientific adventures of the Edisonades and things like Tom Swift Sr. are actually older than pulp and come from a slightly different aesthetics. So I actually also agree that the overlap should be quite interesting because it might not even be punky anymore. It might be steam heroics rather than steam. You know,
Right.
A lot of those characters are trying for the grungy, down and out gutter life aesthetic because it's part of I thought was the part of the appeal. But of course, if you're also writing stories about people in Napoleonic uniforms with brass buttons and refined ladies and you know, red Indians and black savages and stuff, you're going to get interesting variation.
Back in the late 80s, I was at a convention, and I was in the green room where all the authors and editors were talking. And they were joking that back then the preppy movement was big, where people were, you know, dressed in a kind of sportsy upper class look. And there were a group of these authors and editors all talking about how cyberpunk should be branch out into cyber prep, which they thought would be, you know, similar background but not so grungy. And so I was thinking when we were talking the other day, you know, amongst ourselves online about, you know, well, is there punk in the cyberpunk, in the steampunk of something like For Steam and Country? And I was thinking maybe what we need is like steam prep or steam pulp, you know, just the same genre, but not necessarily the same mood.
I coined the term steam pulp in 2001. Before I started using it, it had never been mentioned at all, ever.
It
Well,
fits
it's,
perfectly.
And it was exactly for that reason, to sweep away the punk.
Well,
I
it's
did
one of
the
the
same,
things.
blow me on home for a second. I did the same thing with my book, The Golden Age. I was tired of reading cyberpunk stories about people who were all criminals. I wanted to write something about a hero or even a Greek god. So to do the same thing for the steampunk aesthetic is also, I think, would be interesting. Joji in the comments mentions that gas lamp fantasy is another term for it.
That's actually, yeah, that was something I read. There's a book I read. Someone recommended it to me. One of the Latin teachers in my high school recommended two books to me, which she shouldn't have done because now I'm hopelessly addicted. One was hopelessly addicted to one of them, and that was she recommended the Dresden Files to me. She also recommended a series called The Elemental Masters by Mercedes Lackey. And one of the things that she said in like the foreword to the first book I read, which is called The Serpent's Shadow, was this is what she referred to as gaslamp fantasy. It's set in Victorian London, except the main characters are magicians. And it was a different tone than something like, I think, than steampunk. But the issue I have with steampunk is it's used as a catch-all term for everything from something that's kind of grungy, like, say, the game Dishonored, which is something I've played, and it's used to explain that and also explain Jim Butcher's new Cinder Spires book, which is about nobles, and I think one of them's the captain of a ship, and you don't really see a criminal element or a punk element to that. It's just the aesthetic there.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a word, I think, that has its own meaning above the parts. The same way when we say cowboy, we don't often think about boys playing with cows. You know what I mean? I think steampunk has gone on to mean it. There is actually a difference between gas lamp fantasy and steampunk as it would generally be used, and that is, of course, steampunk tends to have steam-related technologies with gears like a clock that don't exist in our world, as opposed to a story that takes place in a Victorian setting but maybe has magic.
Yeah, Elemental Masters was definitely the latter, not the former.
Yeah, and I think that steampunk nowadays means stories with airships and gears in them, but it doesn't actually mean punky as much as it used to.
See, here, I kind of agree with that, but I'm going to disagree on what is punk at this point. So punk is something that is subversive or superversive, as it may be, and it is kind of anti-establishment, anti-status quo kind kind of just saying, you know, screw it, I'm going to be an individualist and go off in my own direction. That was kind of the original punk rock. That's what the Clash were all after, and you know, they were changing the culture based on that. If you look at science fiction and fantasy culture and how dark everything is, and how just everything kind of blends with horror now, and everything just is kind of dreary and dystopian. I mean, is there much more punk than going opposite of that and just telling a pulp adventure like the old days? I mean, tough to find something more punk.
The original use of steampunk was a joke. It was author K.W. Jeter, who had written some of these retro Victorian science fiction novels, said that now that Tim Powers and James Blaylock were all writing similar books that had become a literary movement. He was joking about this. He wasn't serious, and that they needed a new term for it. And then he said, "Well, why don't we call it steampunk?" He actually said this in a either a column or a letter to a magazine. So there wasn't any in the original usage. The only reason why punk was there is because it was a joke on cyberpunk. It wasn't until the difference engine. It wasn't until the difference engine in 1990, which was Bruce Sterling and William Gibson, who were, of course, famous cyberpunk writers, wrote the difference engine, which was basically all of the tropes of cyberpunk transferred to the Victorian era in an alternate history, that steampunk became actually punk. Up until then, it was just basically retro-futuristic novels that are of Victoriana.
Yeah, and I think what I was saying is that to a lot of people, that's what steampunk is. It's a word that means certain tropes and ideas and period, and much less means what type of story you're going to have with that.
True.
Steampunk is very much a shallow genre. It's all entirely about the appearance and the outer look of things, of costumes, of equipment, of machinery, of
the props and setting, in other words. The props and setting.
Exactly. The props, the scenery.
Right.
There's no thematic consonants or constants in what works are called steampunk.
Yeah, it's different.
It's more like saying, I set my story in Victorian times. I set my story in medieval times. I set my story in World War II. I set my story in steampunk times. You can put any story there, but if it's semi-Victorian, but it has airships and weird gear machines, then it comes over steampunk. But it could be a tragedy, it could be a love story, it could be a comedy.
You have to have the ability to have Captain Nemo fighting Robert, the Master of the World, at some point in the background. It doesn't have to take place in the foreground. I was going to say steampunk is getting a little long in the tooth nowadays, because the difference engine was 1990, so that's like 30 years ago. But the first time I ever saw anything that was long before the name got invented was a Czechoslovakian animated film called the Atrocious Weapon or the Terrible Weapon. That was actually just a Jules Verne story, and the guy had decided to make everything look like a woodcut book plate, and so they had things like steam-powered submarines and flying machines and so on. That were all retro Victorian, alternate technologies that couldn't actually exist in our world. The thing was beautiful looking, and the name and the name of the author, the filmmaker, escapes me, even though he's the most famous Czechoslovakian animator ever. And I'd have to look it up on the internet. I can't think of it. But so I recommend any fan of steampunk should at least look at that film, if I can tell you the name, to get a good idea for what the look and feel should look like.
If you can find a link
to that on your blog one point. You talked about it on your blog.
Yeah, I did.
That was a live action film, though. I looked at it.
Yep.
If you can find a link or info, John, and put it in the comments at some point, Jason can put it up on the website later.
Can do.
As of right now, steampunk is a small subculture that's pretty thriving. I bought a copy of Jeff Vandermeer's Steampunk Bible, which covers the subculture and artistic works and stuff. And then last year,
that's a cool book.
there was a documentary movie released called Vintage Tomorrows, which covers the steampunk movement. And I watched that it's a couple hours. You can get it on, on streaming on demand. You can rent it on Amazon or iTunes or whatever. And all of it, the more you dig into it, the more you realize it's all about costumes, props, and scenery. There is very, very little actual core. So that means you can do anything you want with it. So people who are writing pulp adventure stories, which I think would be the best use of the setting, if you're going to stage it in Victorian times, which is the time of adventures. It's the time of Sherlock Holmes, and you get all of these other great adventure stories that come out of it. You might as well write adventure stories instead of kind of dour, boring, nasty stories, or paranormal romance is worse.
It's not like something like, say, dark fantasy where you can't where there's a thematic element to it, or something like urban fantasy where it's a specific setting. You could have a steampunk story set out in the countryside as long as all the props you're coming for have enough brass and gears on them. It's an odd genre because it's instead of focusing on the core feelings or the core themes of a genre or even settings, it focuses on what people would almost consider more superfluous aspects, the aesthetics of a genre, what things look like, as opposed to the themes that are embraced.
I think it's a little more than that. I think it's a time period-ish thing. Like, I mean, you can say the same sort of thing about Weird West, like where Weird West is really just people in cowboys being in the fantasy genre or a horror genre or a paranormal romance genre.
If I may, you can say the same thing about the Western. The Western is any story that takes place in that setting.
Exactly. So I think that setting is more than just people's costumes and props. I think it does elicit thoughts and feels of a time period where it's an industrial, like the sort of birth of industrialization, versus like a medieval sort of thing.
And yet all of the social tropes, all of the themes that they're actually using in steampunk works are not about Victorian era stuff. They're actually modern or hyper modern. They use that as to comment on how bad industrialization is for today, or they use it to demonstrate how good modern day sexual mores are, or whatever. They're very
irritates the hell out of me.
Works.
I have to agree with Daddy Warpig. Most of the steampunk that I've seen, and I haven't seen that much, but it's all been anti-Victorian rather than pro-Victorian.
In fact,
oddly enough,
it's very bizarre because
pro-Victorian. I had it star some Victorian characters who had Victorian morality. I admire those guys.
In the Vintage Tomorrows documentary, they have a black steampunk author who talks about how triggering it is to show soldiers in pith helmets, Victorian soldiers wearing pith helmets, because of all the colonization that went on in Africa. And therefore, she says that nobody who's writing or making steampunk or doing cosplay with steampunk costumes can use pith helmets because that's triggering for her as a black woman. And this is treated seriously. The documentary treats it seriously.
I would say, pith helmets. I just Googled what they look like because I know what you mean now, but I'd say if you wanted to go full steampunk, there needs to be more brass on them. But I remember I read the sample of a book, and I might see if I can't get it through my library because I've heard China Mieville apparently does this a lot because he embraces a lot of themes like this. But the Jim Butcher book I read didn't really do that. It was more of an adventure story, though. It showed that he did a lot of research on naval battles because those scenes took forever. In his Aeronauts Windlass or Winelass, however you say it. The naval battles, because everything was three-dimensional, was a lot. There was, I think, almost too much description. I'm like, what the heck is... it distracted me, and it was... that was like my only gripe with it. Other than that, the series was tons of fun. But that's Butcher for you. Fun.
I think steampunk lends itself to superversive storytelling very well as well, in that it has a real aesthetic where beauty is valued, artistry is valued, ingenuity is valued. There's an awful lot of opportunities for real creativity and inventiveness and uplifting stories that probably aren't being told right now, but we need to be. It's just that looking at the example of Girl Genius, which I know is gaslamp fantasy, but that's the kind of
I think
wackiness you can let yourself really go way over the top. You can have really iconic, larger than life characters, really iconic, larger than life situations and inventions and whole cultures, and I think it's something that could be very powerful.
Would you guys consider League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore to be a steampunk?
The movie, at the very least.
I definitely do. I think it keeps all those themes in mind, for sure.
I'm sad to say my main familiarity with steampunk is just Abney Park songs.
Yeah, but
I haven't actually read any of the books, but I've listened to all their songs. So it's like having, steampunk opera going on in the background.
I want to make a quick recommendation to all the writers who are on the panel and who are listening. If what you want to do is write some stories that touch on themes and characters and situations of the Victorian era, I would highly recommend the book, The Encyclopedia of Fantastic Victoriana. It's by Jess Nevins. And for the longest time, you could only get it available in hardback, and it was very, very rare. So you had to pay literally, $250, $500 to get a copy of the book. They just released it on Kindle very recently, so you can get it for $10. But it is literally an encyclopedic compendium of books and characters and tropes, like anarchist novels, for example. You really ought to read the anarchist novel entry from this encyclopedia, because it's mind-blowing that just by reading through the A's and taking notes, there were so many ideas for stories, so many ideas for characters that you can use far beyond steampunk. It is a treasure trove, and my big regret of the book is I haven't been able to read all the way through it.
I will definitely put that on my list then. Doing that right now.
Let me also emphasize and agree with Daddy Warpig that steampunk, like a Western, is a setting. And within that setting, you have wide latitude for, you can throw in anarchist societies and Chinese Boxer rebellions and a guy experimenting with a drug that unleashes good and evil in his own brain, not to mention have airship battles between the British Empire and the French and so on and so forth.
John, we were just talking with Pierce before we started here about.
Jon Del Arroz, because if you're talking to me, you have to say Mr. Wright. Otherwise, I don't
sorry, Mr. Wright. About
okay.
The High House. And The High House, of course, by James Stoddard, was a anarchist gaslight fantasy type story.
Yeah. Oh, I also would recommend that if you want to read steampunk that's gaslamp fantasy, that's not punkish at all, that does have a superversive overtone to it, definitely read The High House by James Stoddard, because it takes place in the late Victorian era in a house that runs the universe secretly. The house is actually bigger than the surrounding planet that it's standing on.
Ooh.
It's rather
cool.
Property taxes must be like astronomical on that.
Well, the observatory on top of the roof runs the stars, for example. And there's whole nations inside the living rooms and dining rooms that go on for acres and miles. And they have to go hunting the tigers in the living room, in the den. So it's that kind of story.
I will have to go check this out because it looks quite entertaining.
Oh, he is an underrated. He's a writer that needs more recognition, James Stoddard.
So he won the Captain Crook for his first book, so he was noted at one point, but then since he doesn't write as fast as some other people, it's kind of been overlooked.
And he's a pal of mine. He's the guy who got me started writing Nightland stories, which are also steampunky in a way, because the Nightlands was originally written by a guy at the turn of the century. A guy who died in World War I. About it was a far future novel about after the sun had gone out.
Huh.
But there's no airships in the story because the air is too thin to bear the weight of heavier than air flying machines. Even though the main character comes across one that has crash landed thousands and millions of years ago.
This is the Nightland, I assume, not the.
The Nightland story.
High
It was
House.
written. It was written. No. Nightlands is a different guy. High House is James Stoddard. Nightlands is written by a guy named William Hope Hodgson, who's
The connection is that the guy who wrote The High House was one of the people writing Nightland stories and knew the guy who was doing it and introduced John. So that's how John's Nightland stories got published.
And Stoddard also has written a version of the Nightland story.
I saw that too, the Amazon recommended list, as well as your book, Iron Chamber of Memory. So,
which is not steampunk.
No, still good, but
I think it
but
almost
it
counts.
almost feels Victorian, even though it takes place in modern day.
It doesn't feel Victorian. Well, it does have a baron though, or something like that. No, it's not steampunk. Sorry, it doesn't count.
But it's not Baron von Monocle, which I must say is a rather cool name.
I've got a question for people who are familiar with steampunk. It strikes me as odd, and I don't mean odd in a bad way, that so much of steampunk has horror elements to it. And I'm thinking of Tim Powers' Anubis Gates and its sequels, but also of Cherry Priest's Bone Crusher novels and sequels, that they have a lot of horror in them.
They're almost zombie books.
Yeah, Bone Crusher and its sequels are full-on zombie movie in parts, but the horror they have isn't Victorian Gothic horror. It's not your traditional horror. It is very, very modern horror, imported or exported into this steam universe. I'm just wondering, what is it about the steampunk subculture that makes that such a common trope, that instead of using period horror stories, that they use really modern takes on horror?
My
I would
theory
say
is
that, I'm thinking it's the same reason that Jeffrey Johnson found out all the pulps have been forgotten. I think it's because I'd say all the old Edwardian Victorian horror has also been forgotten. So they remember there was a horror connection there, at least like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has survived. But because they don't know about the classic horror from that time period, they have to go with what they do know, which is the modern horror.
It's one of the things.
And Frankenstein goes from. Leave the mic there. You don't. It'll keep our voices from this far away. Correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen. Can you hear us just fine when we talk? Can you hear him?
I heard
Me?
you both just fine.
Okay.
It was actually one of the things that I actually liked about my English class was the teacher introduced me to an author that is, I have the book right here, Arthur Machen, the author of the book The Three Impostors and the Great God Pan, which is very interesting because it's horror, but it's not the kind of horror that we see today. And I think that's part of the issue that some people have, is when they think horror, they think of whatever they had just seen. They don't understand that that genre has different veins in it. You can have something that's more psychological, things that I think the real horror in Dracula isn't the scene where he's sucking someone's blood. It's watching the transformation of Mina as she's being corrupted by this thing. It's watching Lucy go from a lovely and sweet woman to basically a demon. It's the horror aspect of our age, I think, is much more visceral and more explicit, in the sense that you have to see blood, you have to see gore. It doesn't have the more subtle effects that Victorian books had, where
we might even use the word cinematic. A lot of modern horror imitates the movies, which have different strengths and weaknesses. So they're relying on the visual rather than mood, and then when that comes back to books, it comes out as kind of blatant and straightforward.
I'll point out one other factor that was present, which is Arthur Mencken, and you make me feel rather old because that was like the first horror stories I read. Arthur Mencken and H.P. Lovecraft and other horror writers of the day and age were writing their stories in the same format as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's detective stories, where the horror was based on the slow reveal, as one clue after another would build up to what was really going on.
The novel of the Black Seal's that way.
And part of it is because and People of the Mound, which I think it's Macon, and
yeah,
Part of it was that readers in that day and age and of that genre were more literary than readers these days, because that's what they were used to, a more intellectual approach to their, at least authors of that type. I'm not saying that there wasn't other types of story, but even the Fu Manchu stories that came slightly later and were a little more pulpy still were proceeded in that kind of step-by-step Victorian logical fashion, going from the ordinary to the increasingly less ordinary. One reason, for example, why Jules Verne had all his submarines and flying ships decorated like a drawing room, so that a person could sit in the drawing room and imagine easily what it would be like to look out the windows, was looking at the portal of an airship or a submarine.
If I could also make a suggestion, very often the horror tales of pre-modern societies were oriented around the dangers of Bacchanalia and Pan. I'm relating a article somebody posted on the Castalia House blog, so if I remembered the author's name, I would say it. I apologize, I don't. They're the dangers of bohemian lifestyle. They're the dangers of being consumed by drink and alternate sexual mores and things like that. And it's really hard to write a horror story that warns of the dangers of being consumed by sensuality and licentiousness and stuff, and sell that to people who themselves have already been consumed by that. They don't see that as being horror. That's their day-to-day existence. And so a lot of the themes of that old horror aren't going to move many modern audiences.
Well, maybe that's why they're punkish. They're warning of the dangers of Victorian control and Puritanism. Maybe all these dystopian novels have that in common or something. I'm just guessing. I don't know. I haven't read anything that's actually like that.
So I have a question for our launching author, John, as opposed to Mr. Wright, John. So how did you come?
I'm John without the superfluous H.
It's hard to not pronounce the H when saying your name.
Thank you very much.
But I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about what drew you personally to cyberpunk, and how you felt your story either lives up to the tropes or takes a new turn on the normal cyberpunk tropes, or just talk a little bit about the creative process of how you came to the genre.
Steampunk, not cyberpunk. I've never written a cyberpunk thing. Maybe I'll do that next. Yeah, I don't know. I was just into cosplay, and I wanted a fantasy story that was fun, and I wanted something just like everybody's been talking about. A lot of the steampunk that I read was just in two directions. It was either that like complete horror, modern cinematic horror that was skinned in Victorian times, and most of it I see is actually alt history. I don't see a ton of unique fantasy worlds. Is another thing that drew me to it. It's like I need to do this because I don't see unique fantasy worlds with this setting so much, and I think the world could use more of that. I've discovered a few since then. I'm reading right now The Guns Above by Robin Bennis, which HP over on Twitter turned me on to, and it's fabulous. I mean, it is Honor Harrington in a steampunk setting, so I'm very happy with that. But I wanted something with like a lighter tone than that too, because I also am just into, I guess, feeling good and having heroes and having that feeling like when I was a kid watching, the original Star Wars for the first time and seeing Luke Skywalker, every man coming up and discovering himself and finding he can do great things. I wanted to do that with a character, and so I just mashed all those things together and went for it. The main theme, the other main reason I wrote it is because I played the Final Fantasy video games when I was a kid, and I just flew around on the airships for hours, and I just I wanted a story with that too.
So Marina, I know you read the book. Do you think he accomplished what he's describing?
He definitely did. And I even said in my review that I was never really had an attraction to steampunk, but I read this book and I'm thinking, hey, this is something I can get into as a genre. And listening to John, maybe not, if you were trying to do something very different, because I did like the whole fun and the innocence of it, and it almost took me back to when I was a teenager and I was reading all the adventure stories, basically whatever adventures I could find, whether it was Victorian or whatever. I didn't have a whole lot to choose from growing up where I did. So it really is, in a way, a throwback for me, but on the other hand, it sounds like something very revolutionary. So, great.
I think there's definitely it's kind of like with the pulps going back. There's definitely a need for more innocent adventure and fun.
I'm actually writing up a steampunk series now, just in the planning stages, and I take a mix of pretty much a bunch of different genres. It's what happens after I read a bunch of Lovecraft and Mac, and then I played a bunch of steampunk games, and I'm like, what happens when the bad guys, are these horrible, mind-wrenching things, and then the good guys are able to, go toe-to-toe with them, and that's kind of what this story I'm sketching out with is. And the real reason I really like to do it is because there's a visual art style that I'm very enamored with that fits very, very well with steampunk aesthetics, and that is the Art Nouveau art movement that's really can be exemplified in the works of Alphonse Mucha, who has lots of flowing lines, lots of kind of simplified color schemes that makes it look much more it looks more like an illustration than a realistic painting in that sense, and it's something that's quite beautiful, and I see a lot of steampunk stuff that goes along with it, and it fits very well. And actually, the funny story about Alphonse Mucha, he used to do opera posters for advertising for opera stuff, for operas occurring in London, and the opera houses that would put these on used to have issues. They used to have problems keeping the stuff because people would go around with razors and literally cut the posters for these different operas, like Medea or plays. They would cut them off they paste a poster up on a wall, and you'd have townspeople who would come across it and literally cut the poster down and frame it in their house because they liked his stuff that much. And I liked it. I liked it a lot, and that kind of introduced me to steampunk, and I'm like, I thought it was really fascinating, and that and a game called Dishonored really, really interested me in that. It's that's actually something interesting, steampunk in video games, where you can have much more interactivity than something like than something like a movie or a book might have, where you could actually go around and explore a world in a slightly more different fashion, like Dishonored did, for example. And I murdered the conversation. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I wish I had time to play video games. It'd be great.
Yeah. There have not been a lot of steampunk video games, and the ones that have come out have been mainly mediocre. Not all of them mediocre, but mainly mediocre. Dishonored is very well thought of. There's even a sequel, Dishonored 2. It is fantasy steampunk.
I've yet to get that.
It is fantasy steampunk set in a second world. Another commonly cited cult classic video game is Arcanum of Steamwork and Magic Obscura. It's about a steampunk world where magic and technology are at war with each other. And that is also well thought of. It's an RPG, so it takes a lot of time to become involved in. It's an older game, and so it looks really, really abominable to people who are used to modern day games. It's also very well thought of, but I haven't had a chance to play that. Steampunk it hasn't made a big impact in movies. It hasn't made a big impact in tabletop. Tabletop RPGs are slightly different because there have been a couple of landmark works like Space 1889 and a few other steampunk games that have been very popular. And so it keeps on getting periodic revivals, but it's still not as constant a genre as fantasy. There's always a new fantasy tabletop RPG, and there's very rarely, in comparison, there's rarely new steampunk RPGs. So
I think Space 1889 was one of the first times I ever heard of steampunk as, you know, as kind of a thing in of itself, as opposed to a story set in a certain background. At one point, that was pretty big.
There was an RPG. I guess have you ever played Thunderscape? Anybody here? No, maybe not. It was it's a semi-indie RPG. It was actually a property from the late '90s that somebody developed into an RPG, and it's got a lot of steampunk themes. And it just came out a couple years ago by a guy named Sean Carmen. It's really good. I enjoy it and recommend that one.
Oh, Castle Falkenstein, also the original, you know, big bad guy. Deadlands had a bunch of stuff in there that was very, very steampunky, that were elements that it layered on top of its horror setting.
Yeah, the whole the Collegium and their gadgets and all that are especially. I've worked in that setting, writing for a card game based on that setting, so I'm very well familiar with that.
There's also, and I can't remember the name of it, and I can't find it. I'm frantically Googling it. There's also a really, really cool steampunk game that starts with the premise that the physics of Victorian era were true. And Herschel was right. I'm not sure. I'll have to. And then they developed this entirely internally consistent system of physics, then a bunch of inventions based on that, and that's all placed on top of an old school, the OSR mechanics of classes and hit points and armor class and stuff to build a really interesting setting. And it's not a game I've been able to buy or read, but it definitely sounded like they had put a lot of work into making an interesting and cool steampunk setting.
Yeah, it's actually it's one of the interesting things is because I mentioned there's I had some familiarity with some games, and there's actually one that has some elements of steampunk in it, but I wouldn't truly classify it as steampunk as much as more of a almost Victorian Lovecraftian horror, and that's a game called Bloodborne. It's made by a group called From Software, and I've not had as much tabletop gaming experience. Mine's more digital, but the interesting thing was I was playing that game, Bloodborne, while I was during my college semester when I was reading Arthur Machen, and I'm reading Machen. Then I had to read Lovecraft for part of my final project, and I was struck by the similarities where there are elements of Lovecraftian, and I term it Machenian stuff, Machenian fiction that can go really well with a steampunk or just a general Victorian gas lamp setting that's is underutilized because, as you mentioned before, people have this more cinematic form of horror in mind instead of the insidious fear of finding someone accidentally prescribed the wrong medicine by a chemist that ends up turning them into what looks like a Shoggoth. Instead of that, it's zombies. Which, yeah.
One of the original 3 settings for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, the original settings were modern day, 1930s, and Victorian era. And so there are, if you're interested in doing Call of Cthulhu role-playing in Victorian times, there's a lot of material by Chaosium, which you can probably get quite cheap because it's used in out of print.
I was wondering myself as to why there hadn't been more steampunk movies and TV shows. I was going to make a comment about that, but then I remembered that there was a steampunk show, at least one that I used to watch, called The Secret Adventures of Jules Verne, that was out in the aughts at the turn of the century.
There was also Briscoe County Jr.
Oh, you're right. I would not have normally thought of that, but you're right. It was. I haven't seen a Penny Dreadful, but it's on my list of shows to see. I think that's also
It's gothic horror. It's not steampunk.
Okay. So steampunk it has to have at least one Jules Verne invention in it to count.
It's Penny Dreadful is very, very very, very explicit, very, very bloody, very, very. It's into modern day shock horror. A lot of things. I'm not saying it's a bad show, but you have to be prepared for a lot of explicit violence and gore and nudity, things like that.
I just said Arthur Menken is about my speed when it comes to horror, so I might give it.
Arthur Mack. That's one of the things I've noticed with a lot of modern horror versus stuff I read with Mackin is you don't see the kill shot, so to speak. It's the
reason you gave. I myself am actually more afraid of a pharmacist than I am of a zombie invasion. Because I go to pharmacists and they could put anything in their drugs.
Well, it was an accident from the pharmacist, but then it turns out he had some freaky occult chemical that was used in witchcraft that came from alchemists.
I know. I read the story. So yeah.
Okay, good.
Speaking of steampunk TV shows, there are a couple. There's Wild Wild West from the 60s, which was made into a really bad Will Smith movie in the 90s.
The Will Smith, I would say, was steampunk, but I will deny that Wild Wild West was steampunk. Wild Wild West, he just had the same gadgets that a spy was supposed to have. They were just updated. Like a Derringer that shot out of his wrist that shot a grapnel gun, for example.
Fair enough.
I don't know if that counts.
I can't say I've seen the original series. There was also a series which I only just literally learned about, called Legend, that starred a pre-Stargate Richard Dean Anderson, and post-MacGyver Richard Dean Anderson, and post Star Trek's Q Jon Del Arroz, which is apparently a steampunk series set in 1865, and from the description I read, it sounded interesting, and I want to track this down. The show was called Legend.
I watched Legend when it came out.
Is it any good?
I don't know. I mean, I was 12, and I thought it was awesome at the time. I was so excited to have MacGyver and Q in a show, which were the actors were Richard Dean Anderson and Jon Del Arroz. And I just didn't care. I thought the gadgets were awesome. I thought it was a lot of fun. I have not tracked it down and watched it as an adult. I don't think they ever came out with a DVD release or anything. I think you just got to find it streaming on the internet if you can.
You're making the mistake, John, assuming that the 12-year-old taste is worse than the adult taste. I would argue the opposite, because most 12-year-olds.
You think so?
When I was 12, I enjoyed a lot of things that I can't enjoy these days, and I just think it's because of a curmudgeon, say. So
it might be true. I have no idea, but I was enamored with that show.
It is on DVD on Amazon right now. I just found it.
Wow. I'm going to grab it, and I'll let you guys know in a couple weeks, I guess.
I could have swore I watched an episode or two back
from
when
the
it was
producer of
on.
Deep Space Nine, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, but I have it mixed up in my mind with Bristol County Junior, so I can't remember for sure.
They paired it with Star Trek Voyager when it first came out. So it was the launch of the UPN network, and it came on after Voyager. So I watched it mainly because it was on, and I was watching Star Trek. But I'd love to rediscover that. Thanks for reminding me.
Apparently, it only lasted a season, but anyway.
Yeah.
So yes. Jon Del Arroz before he got old, and Richard Dean Anderson before he got really quite large.
Here's the thing that strikes me when we're discussing steampunk is I've seen several steampunk movies. I've read several steampunk books. I've been deliberately researching the genre for the past long while for a project of my own. But when it comes to sit down and people say, oh yeah, I've heard about steampunk, I really, really like it, there are very, very few works that I could personally recommend that were good enough or enjoyable enough that I would recommend to other people. And in fact, there might just be 2 or 3. I'd recommend 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the 1950-something Disney movie, which is quite excellently well-done movie. Just a very, very great movie.
Certainly established the aesthetic more than anything else. That version of the Nautilus, that look.
I would give a halfway recommendation for Atlantis: The Lost Empire, the animated Disney movie with Michael J. Fox. But as far, and I will note, just to give a caveat here, I haven't read Jon Del Arroz's new novel yet, so this is not at all a commentary on that specific novel. But as for the novels I've read, there are none of them that are fun enough or exciting enough or interesting enough by themselves to truly recommend. It is surprising how little pure entertainment has been given reign in steampunk, when you would think that that would be its natural métier.
I would almost recommend Jim Butcher's Aeronauts Windlass, but the thing is, there's two battles in it that are just they take a while, and it's a lot of describing exactly where the ships are moving and stuff like.
I wouldn't call that a steampunk book.
Why?
I would call that an epic fantasy book that has, because even the technology that drives the airships isn't really steampunk. It's magical and fantasy. So I don't really consider that steampunk. I think Jim Butcher's a brilliant author, and I think that's a great book. And people who want to read The Aeronauts Windlass certainly should. And if you don't want to, you should reconsider, because it's a great book. But I don't really think of it as steampunk myself. So.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the same boat with you. I can't think of a single steampunk book that really stands out, though I can think of one or two anime. And I wonder if it's because it's the visual medium more or something. I don't know.
I think anime really touched on these steampunk themes. If you look at the Studio Ghibli stuff, you've got Howl's Moving Castle, Castle in the Sky. I mean, even Kiki's Delivery Service has the whole like bicycle airship thing going on in it. I mean, he really loved those sort of concepts and added them, at least as a little bit of flavor, to almost every one of his films. Even Princess Mononoke is a beginning of an industrialization fantasy, which has a lot of steam-driven technology that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's all in there.
Yeah, the tanks in Nausicaa: The Valley Wind certainly look like World War I tanks, and the giant insect-shaped ships and stuff. But I agree with you that those are only tangentially steampunk. They look a little bit Victorian. They have rivets showing and stuff.
Mm-hmm. There's a Chinese movie that I mentioned before the show called The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. It is a steampunk. It's set in the 1890s. It's a steampunk martial arts movie. And I'm not saying it's a super great movie, but it's fun.
I just want to chime in that I think we're both seeing the same movie. It's actually 1930s Manchuria, but it feels steampunk because they're just now starting to import technology from the West to the World Wars.
Oh, that reminds me. There's a steampunk show that's actually quite famous. The second Last Airbender show, Legend of Korra, took place in a 1930s-looking magical gas lamp fantasy world that was an Oriental aesthetic to it. But they had automobiles and they had all those other sorts of things.
I didn't like.
Giant airship was one of the major props in the show.
I didn't like Korra as much as The Last Airbender, and I'm not talking about what happened in the last episode. I think that's just because if you look at The Last Airbender, it has one unified story versus 4 different big bad guys. Versus 3 seasons.
We could have a whole 2-hour discussion on the subject of Airbender versus Korra, but I wouldn't bring it up.
Let's not open that can of worms.
Suffice to say they switched writers, but the point of it is they definitely had that steampunk look because they were industrializing. Now you would think that a lot of steampunk shows would deal with the theme of that the industrialization would be one of the main tensions, and certainly if it's magic versus technology story that you mentioned earlier, I forget the name, you would have that.
Arcanum.
Yeah, 2001 RPG. Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. I'm nominating that for the most steampunk title of a video game ever.
It's a good title.
I will nominate for comic book titles. The best title is League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which automatically sounds like of the Victorian version of the Justice League or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and read that again. I mean, I remember I reread it last time when his kind of sequel came out, and I was underwhelmed by the sequel. But that original graphic novel was great.
I frankly did not like the artwork. I thought the artist that Alan Moore had working with him for Watchmen was better. And there's a lot of things about Alan Moore that I would prefer to read him when I'm 12 rather than when I'm 55. It's just one of those things.
Yeah, I feel you there.
On the topic of comic books, I'd also propose as runner-up for most steampunk comic book name, The Amazing Screw-On Head and Other Curious Objects that Mike Mignola did.
Oh, I'm reminded of another steampunk book, and this is from before the days of when it was called this. Michael Moorcock wrote The Steel Czar, The Land Leviathan, and the something else. It was a trilogy of alternate history books, roughly in the Civil War era. I can't think of the third book, but Michael Moorcock did steampunky stuff back before it was steampunk.
Cool.
I mentioned Abney Park before, but it occurs to me that.
Wait, I don't know if you guys heard that question, which is really good.
Can we retroactively make something steampunk or not? Because I feel like there's certain tropes that Jules Verne would not be able to get away with, but a work that is self-aware that it's steampunk can.
Which is funny because, of course, steampunk is itself a retroactive genre.
Well,
sorry, I didn't mean to derail
it. Steampunk was coined to retroactively incorporate works into. It was originally a joke, but into this pseudo genre. It didn't become a thing until later. So all genres, every single genre that's ever been, and I'm not even talking about fantasy and science fiction or speculative fiction genre. I'm talking about musical genres, whatever. There are always works that prefigured developments that would later become a coherent part of the genre. You look like heavy metal or grunge or whatever. There are always going to be bands that came before that have elements that would be considered part of that genre that get retroactively incorporated by the fandom just because of those same elements.
The groundwork.
I would argue that H.G. Wells' writing and the writing of Olaf Stapleton were not considered science fiction at the time. They were scientific romances, but the science fiction genre developed later, and a lot of the tropes that we get from those two writers, come from them. So I completely agree. By the way, the third book I could not think of is called the Warlord of the Air, which is just a great title for a steampunk flavored book.
That's a fabulous title.
It's pre-steampunk now. It's Michael Moore in an alternate universe.
But the thing is, as you said, these steampunk is reckoning back to Wells and Verne. So other people who've written things that are reckoning back to Wells and Verne's tend to automatically have some of the same feel. I was going to say something.
But Moorcock's book was also had that anarchistic flavor that a lot of steampunk has, because Moorcock is himself an anarchist. He's a political radical, and so a lot of at least what I've seen tends to have that kind of grungy, anti-establishment flavor to it. So setting in the Victorian era is usually really funny, but maybe it makes more sense because the Victorian actually had an establishment that actually did run things.
And that was when the anarchists actually were arguing about and fighting, blowing things up. I wanted to say something.
Killing archdukes, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about Abney Park. I mentioned it earlier, but it occurs to me that not everybody might be familiar with it. So there's a rock group called Abney Park that does almost exclusively steampunk music. And they even have a kind of rock opera where the songs kind of go together to make a story. I think there's a novel that went with them, but I don't know if the novel's all that good. But anyway, the songs are really eerie and have a really nice steampunky feeling to them. Some of them are a little bit sad or dark, but others are not. Some of them are pretty rousing. And if you like that kind of mood and story, I recommend you look up the band. You can find most of the stuff online.
Yeah, I think they're really cool. And on the theme, Rush also did a concept album, Clockwork Angel, a few years back that was getting some traction for a bit. And I think that was kind of the pinnacle of its height and culture in terms of steampunk's sort of almost making it into the mainstream. I like that album.
Cool.
Yeah. There's one thing I did want to mention, because I was chatting about I had emailed Jaji about this earlier, that I'm working on a more traditional fantasy book, and this is tangentially related. When you said that people were, hearkening back to Verne and Wells, one of the things that I was talking about was I was kind of taking some of the elements of the author J.R.R. Tolkien, and also kind of not in a very lighthearted way, kind of poking fun at some of the seemingly established tropes that a lot of Tolkien imitators were doing with how they treated things like elves and dwarves and stuff. And one of the things that I was talking to another writer on our Superversive group, and he said that one of the things that he kind of worried about was that what happens when people, don't realize what you're actually doing because they don't have the experience with what you're originally going off of. That's one of the things I worry about. What happens when people are imitating the modern steampunk authors you see, as opposed to going back and reading Jules Verne or reading H.G. Wells?
That's a topic that we've discussed at length with some friends, because before Star Wars and sort of Shannara, almost everyone you talk to would have read the original stuff. They probably read the myths, they read some of the early writers. But nowadays, there's so much out there that there are a lot of writers whose whole responses are to relatively recent things, idea of what the tradition is behind it. And as you say, you both, I'm reminded of a friend who went to see a submarine movie and came out and said he was really bored because he'd seen every single one of those things before, but the audience around him enjoyed it perfectly well because they hadn't seen all the earlier submarine movies. And there's on one hand, there's no particular loss if you're, doing something and the other guy who's reading it knows about what you know. But on the other hand, there's a richness that comes from the greater tradition that if you don't have it, it's not there to inform your artistic vision. But yet, on the other hand, as you said, if the people reading your thing have not seen the things that you're riffing, then you lose a certain level of your of the charm of what you're doing.
That happened to me with a story of mine called One Bright Star, where I was riffing off of maybe 5 or 10 British schoolchildren books that I had read, including the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, but at least 4 or 5 other books where I stole ideas directly from them, and sometimes not even bothering to file off the serial numbers. But I found out to my surprise that most of my reviewers who reviewed it hadn't read any of those other books, and so they looked at my book through the lens of me writing a Narnia story, and of course, in so doing, they lost more than half of what I was saying. Now, if I had been a more skilled writer, I could have tried to convey a sufficiently exciting story independently enough so that any reader who doesn't grasp the background still can appreciate whatever's going on in the foreground, if you understand what I'm saying. It's like how Shakespeare writes. He writes jokes for the groundlings, but he also writes highfalutin stuff for the guys sitting in the nicer seats, but he manages to please everyone. That's the goal, is to please people, just no matter what level their background is.
Right. But yeah, because it's one of the things I saw some article about, or someone had commented something about that all of Tolkien's different races and stuff were based off of racial stereotypes. I'm like, no, it was something about dwarves were based off the racist stereotypes of Jews being because they had big noses, and this isn't what I was saying. This is what someone else was saying, that big noses and they like money. I'm like, no, they're ugly. They're from the Poetic Edda. They're Svartalfs.
The important thing when you meet a person who talks that way is to back up slowly, speaking in a gentle voice, trying to stick to brain them, okay? Because they can't be reasoned with, and they're dangerous. They're dangerous. The dwarves
they
are all
seem semi-reasonable, so I
from the Elder Eddas, and the dwarves themselves act like proper Germanic Beowulf type warriors who are out to get the gold. That's what they're shooting for.
I backed away slowly online. I backed away slowly online and linked a copy of Tom Simon's book on Tolkien.
Say again?
I backed away slowly online and said, you know nothing about this. If you want to actually learn some stuff, read this, because
Tom Simon's a good man.
Yeah.
For that, I really enjoyed his book. You know, I've reread Tolkien many times, but Tom Simon had some insights that really opened my eyes.
Yeah, I'm
one insight I had was, of course,
this.
It's unrelated to the steampunk topic, but I just wanted to say, it occurred to me that Middle Earth was medieval Europe, where the north, instead of breaking into north and south, in real Europe they broke into east and west, and that Minas Tirith was Constantinople being mugged by the Mohammedans, by the Payanims.
Yeah, and the issue is that there's aspects of history that are played out that people don't understand anymore because I don't know. I feel like trying to divine it.
History is the enemy of a certain faction of people, and if you get Daddy Warpig to talk about it, he'll tell you that one reason why the pulp novels are almost forgotten these days was because they were kind of deliberately forgotten by people who wanted to forget an entire branch of our literary history. And a similar thing happened in the 80s. There's a bunch of people nowadays who haven't read anything written in the 60s, 50s, or 40s, science fiction, who haven't read any of the greats from those 2 or 3 generations of writers, basically for political reasons. They want to be they've been declared unpersons by Big Brother and shoved down the memory hole.
I heard someone saying that, this one modern author writes truly mind-bending fantasy, and this author had introduced one kind of cool concept in their fantasy world, but they don't hold a candle to the amount of mind-boggling stuff that goes on in just the first half of 9 Princes in Amber.
Or any of the Dying Earth novels.
Those too.
Which are really depressing and have really terrible people as main characters, but are just insanely imaginative
and very charming.
I was on the edge of my seat, and I'm like, wait, hold on, and I page back. Oh, I'm on the edge of my seat, super excited over the description of a guy's garden. I'm like, that's never happened to me before.
I was on the edge of my seat over the description of a pack of cards that the amnesiac finds in the house of a woman who may or may not be his sister. You know?
Yeah, those are cool. I want to go draw those now.
You're not the only one. Oh, and by the way, I was going to say earlier that now that you've read Zelazny, you can ease your backlog of books to read, because now you can skip half of what I've written. Because if you've read 9 Princes of Amber, you've read half my books.
I'll still read it.
Thank you.
But anyway, should we try to meander back to topic onto steampunk?
Yes, certainly.
I want to editorialize for just a second. I am so pissed off. Apologies for using, stronger language. I am so pissed off because Victoriana as an era and also steampunk as a form of alternate technology is so rich with potentialities, so rich with opportunities that have been, by and large, completely neglected by the so-called steampunk movement. People call themselves a movement, and yet they have done nothing to exploit the opportunities inherent in the material they're working from. I want to talk about one specific thing and I want you not to necessarily pay attention directly to everything about this one specific thing, but use it as a template. Imagine that there are hundreds of things just like this that are just as rich, that are just waiting for somebody to come along and pluck them out of the past and put them in the center of a novel or a story. there is an entire subgenre of Victorian novels called anarchist novels. And these are novels about evil people from the continent, from outside Great Britain, who are murderers. They're bomb-throwing anarchists. It's their goal to completely upend and destroy society, to throw it into chaos so that they can bring about their own violent goals. And a person comes from the continent to Victorian England, to Britain, and for whatever reason, either a murder mystery is being carried out and the person finds out that the detective finds out that the person doing it is an anarchist, or a good woman falls in love with someone and finds out they're really a murderous anarchist, or they're carrying out a plot to assassinate the queen. There are novel after novel of how these particular anarchists, Russians, Germans, and so on, play into the evils of these stories. And here's the thing, that anarchist novels could be sneered at. You could say, oh, well, they're just the paranoia of this time. And yet, it was literally bomb-throwing anarchists who assassinated the Tsar Alexander II. They assassinated colonels and generals in the Russian armies. I mean, these were real things that were going on. And they started World War I. Yes.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
These exactly, all of these things, and that's just one tiny piece of this vast tapestry of literature, of folklore, of legend that could be exploited to make really, really awesome works. I mean, imagine that you're living aboard a floating city. It's a steampunk world. You've got not just an airship, but an entire floating city. And someone comes aboard this floating city with a bomb that could bring all of it down and kill tens of thousands of people. And you're a detective racing against time to try and find out who are allies of this anarchist on your city, who has let them on, why they're on here, and to stop them from killing all these people and sending your city plunging into the ocean or plunging into England and crashing and obliterating the countryside. That is a story with promise. It's got adventure. It's got mystery. You could throw romance in there, and that's just one teeny tiny element that's been completely neglected by the steampunk movement, and I am gravely disappointed that they've had 40 or 50 years to do something unique with this genre and have done almost nothing with it.
Well, now I'm going to have to thank you for my the front of my steampunk book.
A similar thing happened back in the day with science.
April.
When it was just when people were not exploring and exploiting the possibilities of real science, of putting real science into the stories. That's one of the things that John W. Campbell Jr. did. The only thing I was going to mention was that if you want to read a perfectly cracking anarchist story, one I would recommend to anyone is A Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah. That's not really steampunk, though, is it?
No, it's not steampunk, but it's a Victorian anarchist novel. It's a gaslamp fantasy novel. And I also have I have those same anarchists in my novel, but I don't think mine would count as a gaslamp fantasy.
So, do we want to hear from April now? Yes.
Hello, I'm here. Yes. Hi, guys.
Hey, April.
Hey, April.
Hey, April.
Hi.
Do you have any?
Let's see. I don't know what the conversation has been so far, but I have read the first chapter of For Steam and Country.
Cool, my favorite.
I note that April's.
So far, the ferret is my favorite.
Me too.
I really like it though. It's you do a really good job describing the people and drawing, like painting the scene and all the like senses and the feelings and how everything looks. So that really draws it in. So good job on that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I was going to say that April's picture almost looks like a steampunky outfit. We were discussing how
Says
putting
the
a
woman who
corset
has-
on the outside instantly says that it's steampunk. It's like the steampunk thing. So she almost looks like that's what she's wearing.
Says a
Needs
woman
more
who's
brass.
Almost.
wearing their dress.
Well, Jaja, you're more Victorian.
Mine is actually a picture out of Harper's Bazaar of actual Worth dresses from the Victorian age. So if it looks Victorian, there's a good reason for it.
All we need to do is slap a mini boiler on that thing, and then it's steampunk.
Yeah,
Or
like a
some-
little like
Yeah, if I added some gears or
Boiler.
something.
Some gear. Oh, I did
Gears on
once. I wonder
Epaulets.
if I can. I did once dress up as a steampunk ballerina for the Renaissance Festival.
That's awesome.
I like the idea of steampunk ballerina.
I'll have to. I'll have to send an
Dancing through
email
the
to you
air.
guys of the picture. I wore point shoes all day. It was quite a feat.
Well, here's the other interesting thing I thought is that steampunk oftentimes tends to mimic other genres, like it doesn't have robots, it doesn't have androids, it has automata, and it uses, instead of computers, it uses clockwork machines, like a Babbage machine,
Babbage machines.
like you used in Some Weather, which is insane, by the way.
Someone that is steampunk. It's Babylonian steampunk, but it's
Interdimensional steampunk.
No, they had an airship. Anything with an airship, and it's steampunk automatically. The Hindenburg disaster was steampunk automatically. What was the third Indiana Jones movie? Who had an airship in it?
Yeah.
Last Crusade.
Last Crusade.
Connection with horror lets you put fancy elements in the steampunk that you couldn't get away with in a purely like scientific romance kind of story. Like in steampunk, you have an automata, but you could also have a robot driven by the ghost of its creator or something.
And the mummy that the British archaeologist unwisely woke up in Egypt.
Yeah.
Who's falling in love with his daughter. Who's the reincarnation of Unc Cinnamon.
Thanks. Yeah, you can pretty much do anything with steampunk because it's a genre that is more aesthetically driven than it is thematically driven. Like you can't. I don't know. I say this with it's probably been done before, but I imagine it'd be really hard to have a setting filled with rainbows and unicorns for a dark fantasy like something like Elric that would kind of be out of place. With steampunk, you can kind of put anything in there as long as you have the prerequisites.
I need to.
Channel. He's hurled the gauntlet.
No.
Yeah,
I
no.
need to stop talking. Every time somebody makes.
How is that different from a Western or from a space opera? A space opera, as long as you have the theme and setting of rocket ships and ray guns, can't you tell any kind of
Dang it.
story?
You've said this 3 times and you're wrong every time. Westerns do have implicit themes.
What are the implicit themes of Western?
Specifically, Westerns have the theme of the dividing line between civilization and savagery, and that in order to defend civilization, you have to take up the gun and become in part a savage, and so that you are somewhat outcast from society because of that, and then the person who took up the gun moves on. They're always a nomad who leaves town. You see that in Open Range. You see that in so many Westerns. You see that, I love classic Westerns from the 1950s, black and white Westerns. But the person who is absolutely necessary to defend the shopkeepers and the farmers and all these people who aren't gunslingers, they don't have guns themselves, has to take up the morality and the weapons of the enemy in order to defend civilization. And having done so, civilization survives, but they're outcast from civilization and they have to move on.
The other type of Western, though, is the one where the guy
Wagon
is...
Train and Big Valley and Gunsmoke and Maverick, none of which have those themes, and Wild Wild West, which are all take place in the Old West.
And there are romantic Westerns where the ending is that the uncivilized guy gets civilized by settling down.
Or get
But
shot.
one
I
thing.
think that Daddy Warpig is correct that there is a type of Western that has that theme to it. But I think
haven't
it's true that you could also take the Western location and put a very different type of story in it.
Well, there's also something else that I wrote in.
Whether or not the aesthetic of steampunk has implicit themes like the conflict between industrialization and the old way of doing things, for example, which you would think would be there if you were setting stories in a Victorian style world. I do know that space opera actually does also have inherent themes like that. So I will.
That's what I was about to say.
Take correction and stand corrected.
Because I wrote an article during Steampunk month that you guys referenced on your last live stream, where there was a thing that John wrote, where Jon Del Arroz, that is, about some of the coverage that Tor was giving to steampunk. And one of the things that struck me was they had one article that was calling for more of the normal, mundane, everyday life kind of stuff in steampunk, which is not in steampunk, in space opera, which is completely, I guess, almost betraying the spirit of space opera. It's like trying to make something like the quote unquote highbrow literary novels that we all have to read in school. That's like trying to make something like Gurren Lagann. That it's not going to work.
In fact,
That's how I feel about 100%.
If it's mundane every day, it's not space opera.
Right.
I mean, you could say make it science fiction, but space opera, by definition, is huge and dramatic.
I think we should write more circus stories and carnival stories with no clowns, animals, or performers or acrobats than those, and write more of those. Detective stories.
That's exactly what it is. Though granted, what I said about the whole highbrow literary novel, trying to write something like the anime Gurren Lagann on there, I think trying to write something like that anime would probably make it better than what you were trying to write in the first place. But
anyway. In my opinion of such people, I think that they're the enemies of art and life and everything good. And so you should back up slowly from them and pick up a stick while you're doing it. Them too. Those guys also are a nerd.
Well, I have Roger Zelazny's Amber book. I think that's heavy enough to inflict some.
You would not dare wound an Amber book on someone's skull, would you? Use something expendable like a stick or a wand of gold.
That's true.
Maybe you could hit him with the bottom of the book that had the later series in it.
Please.
Yeah, I'll
saving the good books.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I got talked over or not, if I was talking over people, but I do want people to note that I conceded the point to Daddy Warpig, and I knocked over my king.
I want to say this. It completely changes the subject from that. I really do think that steampunk has a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential for imagination. There's a lot of potential for stories. And I'm working on a very big project, and steampunk is part of this project. And when it's matured enough to where I can talk about it in public, I really want to, demonstrate some of the things that can be done with steampunk that are that is not stuck in either paranormal romance, nor is it stuck in bohemian or 1960s counterculture critiques of modern American society. Using steampunk as a venue to critique modern American society is a very perverse use of a genre that could be just amazing. And I really, really want to see more people who are writing adventure stories pick up steampunk and revitalize it. Or maybe vitalize it, because it was never that vital to begin with.
Let me add my word to yours. I was so impressed by what you said about the Western, is that I would say once steampunk has enough stories written in it that people will think of a automatic theme that's built into it, the way you just said what the automatic theme built into Westerns was, and that would have something to do with the Victorian gas lamp era and the tensions that were present there, which are also present in other societies, including our present day. That anyone who brought that out, a group of stories that brought that out, would bring the genre into its maturity.
That leads me to a question I had for the other John. So I was curious, when you were putting together your fantasy steampunk universe, how much you stuck to the real tensions of the real Europe and England, and how much you just kind of struck out on your own?
I kind of struck out on my own. I mean, I looked at I think for the kind of enemy of the Rislandian people, I looked at those kind of World War I pointy helmet military garb, and I went for that.
The Hun.
Yeah.
The dreaded Hun.
They're beautiful.
Rampaging across Europe.
But other than that, I mean, I guess I have a pretty standard British countryside-ish Maine society. That, and I guess with one of my characters, he's actually kind of got that Indian who kind of came over, you know, via trade and all that, and is involved in there. So it kind of has that. But, you know, I kept it way more fantasy and just kind of made things up on a fantasy level much more than I was looking to actually mimic anything in reality.
That is actually something that I'd like to see more of, that where I see a lot of fantasy books, and steampunk especially, since there is such a connection to the culture of Victorian England, where, yeah, everything's kind of going to be in that same sort of Victorian theme. But I see a lot of other fantasy books where they're, oh, this is Victorian England, this is Victorian France, this is no, this is fantasy England, fantasy France, fantasy China. And that's with the steampunk book and the other books I'm trying to write. I'm trying to write completely different cultures that, while are still comprehensible to us, are different than something we've seen. I mean, one of the main characters in my story is like a humanoid newt, so they're going to be a bit different from people.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't go that far into it. I kept most of them. I guess the main people kind of human-esque. There are some supernatural elements kind of laden in the background, which kind of you'll find by the end of the book a lot more. And then I'm going to explore a lot more in future books. But the way I like to set things up is I like to really lay a groundwork in just like human, and then expand out from there, so that people are connected with the characters before we get into the weird stuff. And so that's kind of how I write.
And that's kind of how I do it too. But it's one thing I do want to see is more people go, because I think you see a lot of people who will do this is they'll make fantasy analog countries, and I would want to see. Yep. You know, this culture is not based on ancient Japan. It's not based on ancient China. It's not based off of Sub-Saharan Africa. It's based off of something completely new and completely different. And I think that would be much more. That'd be much more interesting and expensive. I agree.
It is interesting, but it requires a certain amount of knowledge of history and anthropology if you want it to feel real. Because the reason people tend to jump into these other cultures is that there's a logic of how things fit together that's usually below the surface, and a real culture has that. And while, you know, there's plenty of good science fiction and fantasy stories with made-up cultures, the better ones are usually by authors who have some sense of why these things work together, so that you get the feeling there's a logic beneath the surface for the made-up world as well. And of course, steampunk gets that just by having, you know, by the time you have the gears and the airships, you automatically have, you know, certain elements that you have to work in. But
everything should have a reason.
Yeah, well, not just a reason. It has to be a reason that's underlying. Some people might give a reason, but they give it too much on the surface, and it feels too stiff. And some people just throw things together with no reason, and it feels disconnected. So getting a real feeling culture, and many authors do this, so it's not like it can't be done. But I'm just saying you need that. You need to kind of look for. You need to stop and think about many elements of society and make sure that yours. You thought why they do or don't go together, so that you have a feeling of something, so you don't get. So many books have what John and I call the round the corner phenomena. You feel like if you go around the corner, everything will be made of cardboard, and then they have the one historical event, and all references to things in the past are to that one event, and that type of thing really makes you feel like you're in a fake place. But it only takes a little bit of effort to refer to 2 or 3 historical events instead of one, and suddenly it's
I know.
realistic.
It makes a big deal. You have to have 2 or 3 details on everything, and I call some of them superfluous details even that actually are very important because it just makes things feel real. I tried to accomplish this a little bit in the history of my world because I've got a running at the top of every chapter. I've got a sort of journal/log that the main character's father wrote over a period of his tenure running the airship. And so you get little glimpses into what he's doing, and I did have to develop a timeline and figure out how all that fit together and how it kind of mirrors the story that's going on a little bit. So I hope I know a lot of people gloss over those chapter headings when people do that, but I think it adds a lot to the story and a depth to the world I created for this book.
Yeah, it's almost like you give a backstory without us having to read a whole separate backstory. So.
Exactly. That's what I was attempting to do.
I usually like things like that. I mean, I know sometimes people gloss over them, but sometimes I pay a lot of attention to things like that in a book. If it's clever and not just random, you know.
Yeah.
And I like the additional depth that comes from.
Yeah, I went and I actually wrote it separately, then parsed it apart, and then tweaked it so it hit thematically for the chapters. I actually spent a lot of work on it. Something that I love.
It sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds worthwhile.
I turn is at the beginning of every chapter, like the little when the sky dragon men will fly. Add them into the chapter. She gave you a little history. Remember that.
I didn't catch that. You're breaking up.
You're breaking up a bit, John. Could you try it again?
Sorry.
The last sentence or two?
Sorry. That would work because it really gave a depth to Fern of the history. Then all of our partners. But it was cool.
Chapters you sound like you're transmitting more.
John, try disconnecting and reconnecting.
I don't know what
you're breaking up really, really badly.
Right. Disconnect.
Oh wait, I could hear you there. Oops, he's gone.
Jason told him to disconnect and reconnect. That's
I know. I was just saying it for a second. It sounded like he got it, and then I said, "Oh, he's gone." So we probably should talk about something for a moment until he
His
comes
connection
back.
swan song, wasn't it?
You can.
Another thing that you could do in a steampunk background to establish a long-running theme of something that's happening in that era, it occurs to me, is maybe slightly before that era, but the Napoleonic Wars were a major conflict between the old way of doing things, monarchy, and the new way of doing things, the French Republic, the Terror. Everything in our modern world kind of springs out of ideas that were that exploded from the French Republic, or the Napoleonic Empire.
So when I was doing research for Victorian Venus, which is a anthology I wrote a story in, I found out that they think the #1 easiest way to colonize Venus would be to make large airships that would float in the upper atmosphere that's about the same thickness as our atmosphere. Because
that reminds me. I'm actually writing that for my Venus story.
Oh, good. I was just going to say, I think that would be a great location for steampunk stories. Because you have a great reason for having these giant, it would be all airships. You couldn't really land, but it just seems you know that could be a great steampunk background.
Yeah, for the planetary anthology a while ago, my brothers had the idea because they had seen that the best way to live on Venus would to be in the clouds, and so they were talking about making a kite city up there. And then I took that idea and I was thinking about it, and I decided I wanted to have gypsies that have these I don't know, spaceship, like space dirigibles or something that travel around nearby planets. I'm still going to work out the details, but they have basically dirigibles, and they live up in the clouds and have these like rope walks and stuff between them when they settle down for a little bit in one place. They just kind of float and have little rope bridges between each other. So that might turn a little bit steampunk.
Yeah. Hey, John, why don't you try that? You're back online and see if we can hear you.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
All right, good. Yeah, I was talking about the chapter headings of Anne McCaffrey's books and the Pern books. You know, she'd have a little limerick at the beginning of each built as the story went along and gave a great history of Pern just through that. And then she then incorporated that into that's how they communicate their history through the Harpers and the Harper Hall. And that always was something that intrigued me and I thought made for much richer books than if those would have not been there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you went to the trouble of stopping restarting because that was actually rather cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I put a ton of work into those at the beginning, and if you just read the chapter headings by themselves, it should form its own story in a little bit, not all the way, but close to it.
That's quite cool.
Now I want to write a Venus. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it would be a great, I mean, exactly the kind of thing that April's talking about. And there's a number of different ways you could do it, but I think it would be a great location for steampunk style story. Because, you know, I mean, you have certain problems, you know, it's acidy out there, you have to wear a suit or something, but...
also, you know, the temperature should be enough to...
And you can have it be at whatever stage of terraforming you wanted. If you wanted them to be able to move around a little more freely, you could say that it was partially terraformed, you know. Yeah. But I don't know. I just think it'd be a great...
Establish that the atmosphere is all steam and that the information we got from the Russian probes and stuff has been falsified. Steam Venus.
Steam Venus. Well, there's Victorian Venus. Steam Venus might be a good one too. April and I could have done that if we'd thought of it, but now we just have General Venus.
Well, I'll do Steampunk Venus. You can do Steam Venus.
I don't have a story for Venus yet. I have a great idea for a story for Mercury, but I need to actually sit down and write it.
I have like
out of time.
I think you should write the Mercury story quickly.
I've got about a half to 3/4 on my Mercury story.
I'm almost done my Mercury story, but for Venus, I'm actually running a hard SF one on that has to do with terraforming. Cool. I think you'll like it too. There's definitely lots of room for you know, steampunk stories that I think there can be some elements of, because my story has some I'd almost qualify as dark yet slightly hopeful fantasy. It's like Lovecraft, except madness. You have a 99.99% chance of going mad, so there's always that 0.01% chance that it won't happen, and that's what everyone's aiming for. That just tends to. That's kind of what everyone's aiming for. April, apparently you've discovered some sort of forbidden technology and cloned yourself.
There's two Aprils.
Yeah, she's cloned.
Yes.
Oh, yes, I am cloned. There's two of me. Watch out.
I think that's a good thing.
Which one do we have to watch out for, though?
Well, yeah.
The third one.
There's Anne.
Third one. What?
Anyway, Judgy, what were you saying?
I don't remember. It was all knocked out of my thoughts by the cloning of April, but I think I was just laughing at the idea that he was trying for that tiny bit of sanity in the world.
Yeah, but it is one thing I do want there to be, not that I don't think any steampunk horror should be written, but it should be expanded to just be beyond zombies in Victoriana, or I'm gonna fall in love with something and there's an airship somewhere.
Sorry.
All right, my little child woke up from his nap, and I'm gonna have to drop him off so I can go to a wedding here. Thank you for chatting, guys. I love the steampunk chat for Steam and Country out now. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye, John.
Oh, hold on. Mateo wants to say hi.
Hi.
Hi, Mateo.
And Tyler wants to say hi too.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
And bye. Thanks, guys.
Now I feel like Wonder Woman. Look, a baby.
I know, me too. I'm like, I want to hug them.
All right.
I have to go see that still, so that's
I'm
on my
seeing it
list to go
Tuesday.
see.
All right, guys. On that note, we should do final thoughts. Who has final thoughts on steampunk apart from go pick up a Steam and Country now?
Well, as we've discussed here, I think steampunk is very much the undiscovered country. That more should be done with it, and a lot more can be done with it that is being done at the moment.
It is.
You're saying?
I think there's a sense of freedom. I mean, as we were talking about the anarchists and the Victorian sense and the individuality, I think the airships kind of, in the same way that Daddy Warpig kind of summarized the West, the airships often seem to represent a sense of freedom. Being not tied down and being able to come and go. And I think that might be part of the kind of zeitgeist that tends to go along with at least the good steampunk stuff.
Yeah, you go, sir. Okay, I guess I'll go. There's it's basically for steampunk. To some extent, the sky's the limit on the kind of story you can tell. You can do anything, and just because something hasn't been done before, it means that you're the person to go do it. That's how I kind of approach anything. Someone says, nothing's like this has been done before. You go, okay, someone has to be the first. Might as well be me, or you, or whoever does it. So if you look at steampunk and you're like, the only things that anyone seems to be getting of steampunk is as I said, Victorian romance with airships, or zombies on a dirigible. It's you can if you have a different idea from those two things, go ahead, do it, and best of luck.
I would concur. I'm looking forward to it developing into its own genre and not just being an aesthetic that you can slap onto any other genre.
If steampunk is an undiscovered country, then it is time that the country got colonized by people who know what to do with the genre, with the trappings.
I just wanted to say I really appreciated that John brought it into the young adult category, because there's nowadays so little adventure to read for teens, because a lot of young adults is either horrible suicidal stuff or sex, and there's just very little purely entertaining fun stuff. And when you got steamships and travel to unknown worlds, that just has to be something that a lot of teenagers can enjoy.
Yeah, it's different from either the mope fest that I stopped I didn't read too much young adult stuff. I just skipped over kind of to the adult books because all that awaited me was paranormal romance. And I mean, I could take that if there was a side of adventure, but there wasn't. And the other side was just the pity mire. dystopia, and even those I kind of like because they had some elements of adventure, but there are a bunch that were just like, this is an important and meaningful book because it's about as depressing as possible.
Because it's gloomy. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's about issues.
Well,
The book
I'm
has issues,
really.
and the author has issues. He's committed.
Yes.
Committed.
Yes.
He did not make that 1% in Corey's background of guys who remain sane.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited about John's book and its release. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it, and I'm definitely hoping steampunk will get better explored. And I'll probably have my go at some point, stepping in, exploring this island of steampunkian as well.
I think there's another young adult steampunk series.
There's Leviathan. Scott Westerfeld.
I think that
that's a good one. That's a good one. I like that one actually a lot.
I think David Freer wrote some young adult steampunk books. One of them's called Cuttlefish. Can't remember the name of the other one. I haven't read them, but everything I've read by him has been excellent, particularly his kids stuff. So they might be worth checking out. You know, if one is done with For Steam and Country and wants to read something that has a similar kind of mood to it.
I myself like punks and punkiness, but I'm hoping that the genre will be explored and colonized and revitalized, and vitalized to begin with, and be called Gaslamp Fantasy or Gaslamp Alternate or maybe Alt Gas or something. Okay, not Alt Gas. Anything but Alt Gas.
Alt Gas.
We'll just shorten it to gas. We'll just call it gas.
It's a truly
sounds like a pensioner with digestion problems, isn't it?
It's a series for adolescent boys.
It's really appealing to boys, yeah.
Online.
I'm a fan of the term Gaslight just because how it was used in the game Gaslight, where they turned it into an acronym for Glorious Adventures in Science, loosely involving generally historical times.
That's perfect.
Perfect.
That's great.
On that note, I think we should stop. Thank you everyone for your participation, and yeah, we'll talk to everyone again in a month.